Welcome everyone to the EDI Catalyst. We are going to explore topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigeneity in STEM. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Albright, and I'm excited to share with you this new initiative spearheaded by the Carbon to Metal Coding Institute here at Queen's University. At C2MCI, we're committed to advancing EDI in STEM fields by fostering a culture of respect, inclusion, and excellence among our researchers, students, and partners. In this podcast, we will feature special guests from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, discussing some of their lived experiences, as well as providing resources and tips on how to create more inclusive and equitable environments. Through this, we hope to inspire you to become a catalyst for change in your own communities and workplaces. A few notes just before we start. There will be time at the end of the session for any of our members who are listening live today to ask questions. So please remain muted until then, and you can put any questions or comments in the chat as well, and we'll review them at the end. So in today's inaugural talk, we're going to discuss some academic success for Indigenous students, and I'm honored to have with us today our special guest, Genievieve Borg, who is a PhD student in chemistry in the Perez group at Guelph University. Welcome, Jen. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Very good. Just so everyone knows too, I had an opportunity to hear Jen give a talk this year at the Canadian Chemistry Conference at CSC as part of a symposium for Indigenous relationships in chemistry. And it was one of my favorite talks this year at CSC. So I'm really excited to have you here with us today to share some of your experiences with us.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. So maybe we can start by, how about you tell us a little more about yourself and your journey so far?
Yeah. As you said, I'm doing my PhD. I'm focusing on inorganic chemistry. So my research is focused on molecule-based magnetic materials. We're interested in making molecules that have interesting magnetic properties, anything that can be, I guess, relevant to technological advancement. My more into like my background, I've been at Guelph for a very long time. I did my undergrad here. I started my master's, but then switched into my PhD. So I've had a long journey here. I'm from Brantford, Ontario. I am Ojibwe First Nations. I am a status member of Wikwemikong First Nation on Manitoulin Island. That said, I did grow up off reserve. Yeah.
Nice. So what kind of motivated you and inspired you to pursue a career in STEM?
I think I don't know, it kind of all happened sort of by accident. um, so I guess back in high school, I always found science interesting. And we had to take grade 9 and grade 10 science. And then I remember for grade 11's, when we were picking our electives, I like always saw like chemistry. I thought it was kind of cool. And I was like, that's a really difficult subject. And I wanted to challenge myself. So I'm like, I want to get a 90 in that course. So I took it and I achieved my goal. So I was very excited. But also in addition, I realized I really liked the subject matter. It was always something that I realized that it's in a way, chemistry is a way of understanding the universe. When I was in grade 12, I took this physics course as well. And our teacher had us for our culminating project, I think he told us to read a book by a physicist and then kind of recap what you've learned. And we would meet with him every month to like go over it. And I took this, or I was reading this book by Stephen Hawking, and I thought it was just super cool, like seeing or reading about these physicists and like their research and again like a path of understanding the universe. So it kind of just happened that like everyone I knew in high school was going to university. So I was like, okay, that's my next step. And I just picked the subject I was the most interested in, so that was chemistry. And then yeah, that's kind of how it started.
That's really
Yeah.
cool. I've always been interested in science too, and I have a similar kind of story of how I got interested in STEM, and I just kind of naturally was like, well, I like chemistry the best, so I just continued on with whatever
Yeah.
one I was most passionate about. Um, uh, with that, how did you find your culture or community or family even influence your decision and that process in high school, making those decisions to the next step?
I would say my culture, my family didn't really have much of a part of it. I only started reconnecting like 3 or 4 years ago. I always knew I was Ojibwe, but that was it. My mom left the reserve when she was really young, so I didn't learn much about my culture growing up. In terms of my family, of 5 children, I'm the first to graduate high school, let alone go to post-secondary. So it was really just a function of like I was lucky enough that by the time I was born, my parents were living in a good neighborhood. And at the school I went to, everyone was going to university. So I was just like, okay, that's everyone else is doing it. So I guess that's what I'm doing. And that is really how I ended up here.
Nice. So, I guess maybe some of the next question I'll have here for you is because you grew up off reserve, how did that, what kind of challenges or barriers did you face or encountered as an Indigenous student, and how did that kind of affect your path here?
Yeah. So it wasn't until I started reconnecting that I really like kind of put into context my experiences in undergrad, and understanding like those barriers were related to the fact that I'm Indigenous. So the first being that I came to university not knowing a single person that had been to university. So coming here, I didn't have any sort of support system. I didn't know what to, even to this day, like I, the first to do university, let alone like a PhD. So like I'm still kind of in a space where I'm just doing things and hoping I'm succeeding. So far it's been going so good. But yeah, and then I think another challenge I faced was really related to mental health. Um, I think it's mental health is a big issue among Indigenous people, given the history of Canada with Indigenous people and the intergenerational trauma that has come from that. So it wasn't until I got to uni that I really started to see that some of the things I experienced growing up were not the experience of any of my peers. And it really started getting me to think about it. And I think the biggest challenge was I was in first and second year, I was probably having like 5 or 6 panic attacks every day. And they all seemed to happen like during class. So rather than paying attention, I was kind of stuck in my head the whole time. And that was challenging in terms of like, because now like chemistry is hard. And now I have to go back to my dorm room or my house and try and teach myself the material that I like wasn't able to focus on in class. So that was tricky. But then as a result, because it's a hard subject, and I was kind of afraid to talk to my professors at the time, I wasn't doing the best. Like I passing, I was doing fine, but in terms of like scholarships, because financial insecurity was another big thing for me. Um, it was always evident like I can apply to these scholarships, but I'm not going to get it. So and then that kind of fueled like this idea in my head that like I wasn't good enough to be here and I didn't belong to be here. Especially given that like everyone I went to school with was really, they didn't have to work as hard. They worked not as hard as me in terms of studying, and they got significantly better grades than me, which then set them up for awards, scholarships, networking. And I was just kind of in the background, struggling throughout undergrad. So I think that was the biggest barrier, but it was definitely like a trauma induced barrier.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to note for people. And one of the big things I took away from your talk back in CSC as well was understanding that you guys are at a disadvantage just from the get-go because of
Mm-hmm.
the history that you've experienced. And that isn't fair. And I think that's something that we need to understand that is what's going on in order to be able to come up with ways to improve and do better.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that is something relatable as well for most Indigenous students, and having not, I can understand not having the support system as well. I'm also one of the first of my family to go to university, um, especially higher university too. So getting to
Yeah.
master's and PhD, and it's not easy, and you do need a good support system. So it's really hard when you have family or people who haven't gone through that experience that can help you. So I think you then rely a lot on the resources that the schools and your
Mm-hmm.
community can present for you.
And I guess the other tricky part there too is like my school has a wonderful Indigenous student center. And
Yep.
they have tons of great resources, but given like I didn't know anything about my culture, I just knew I was Ojibwe and that was it. And
Yeah.
I did not access any of those resources as an undergrad student. So I was here for 5 years, or I guess 4.5 years, and I stepped in there like twice maybe. But like the two times I did go there, I was like highly intimidated by the students that were there, because I thought like, oh, they're like super indigenous, like they know their culture. I didn't know, like I felt like I wasn't native enough to go, and that was highly like influenced by like the stereotypes of indigenous people in media and like in movies and in TV. I thought I genuinely thought that's what indigenous people were like, and I wasn't that, so I didn't belong in that place. But really, like all of the students that are there are exactly like me. So it's unfortunate that I didn't figure that out until grad school, but I am happy that I did figure it out while I was still here, because that has been an invaluable resource to me.
Yeah, so that kind of leads to the next question too. So since you didn't discover that resource until later, what were some of the resources that did help you get through your undergrad and be able to make it to the next stages of your academic path?
I think honestly, it was just my stubbornness. I yeah, I was like, I sought out to do this and I'm gonna do it. Once I got to third year, I did have some TAs that were quite wonderful, and they were definitely the first TAs that genuinely cared about me as a person. Um, and I saw myself in them, in that like they were the first TAs to be real with me, to like say like, yeah, things don't always work out, and that's fine. Like I've I've failed tests, I've struggled through undergrad, like I wasn't a 90 student and I'm doing my PhD now. And it was that, like I was like, okay, well if she can do it, I think I can do it. And really, like, she's the person that got me into my research group for undergrad. And if I didn't have her as a TA, I probably would have ended up in research, but I wouldn't like have ended up in the group I'm in, and I probably would have faced more struggles, just because like I don't know, having that person that I already knew kind of made it feel a bit safer. So
Yeah.
because the whole process of like getting into research was absolutely terrifying for me. So I think it was that, and then also come third year, I was lucky in that my program was really small. So I think I started to get to know the people in my major, and we all like made this like big group, and we just kind of leaned on each other for support. So it was having that kind of community that was really important to me too, and seeing that like I wasn't the only person struggling to understand this material that's like difficult. Um yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing for a lot of students is realizing you're not alone
Yeah,
and leaning on your peers is a big part of it. And I think this is probably a valuable lesson for a lot of our viewers today too, because majority of our people listening are most likely grad students and postdocs. And I think you can take from this too, we all usually have to TA. You can kind of think of what you can do as a TA to now help
yeah,
your students as well. So we've all gone through it. We've been in the student spot before, but now that we take on that role as a TA, it's good to know that small things can make a difference by caring about your students and not just going and doing your TA work because you have to.
absolutely. Yeah, because yeah, like the reason why I like got like I'm in my group was definitely my TA. Yeah.
Yeah. So this kind of leads into the next question too. What do you think we can do? We kind of already touched on this as peers leaning on each other, but as researchers and where you are in your stage now and where we all are, what can we do to help reduce these barriers and make Indigenous students feel more welcome, or just in general, like what we can do to make uh, more inclusive environments so people
Yeah.
feel welcome and are set up for success?
I think the first step before anything meaningful can happen is for people to listen and to understand to Indigenous stories, and not like people will hear what they want in the news, but it's not the same as going to and listening to a person speak and having them say like, this is my truth, this is what's happened in my life and what's happened to my family. I think it's it's hard to try and fix a problem if you don't know anything about it. And
Agreed.
I think the biggest thing is like we really just need people to understand, and really to listen, because yeah, we can talk all we want about like making more inclusive environments, but until you really understand the barriers Indigenous students face and like the, I guess, the thoughts that like we fight with every day, it'll be quite difficult to try and create those inclusive environments because you don't really know what you're looking to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point in how I feel too, because a lot of the time, from my perspective and things I've experienced is even till very recently, in the past few years, I had no idea the history of Indigenous
Mhm.
people in Canada. And that's sad growing up as a Canadian person. And
Yeah.
I consider myself lucky. I grew up in a community where my high school was actually on a reservation. So I was pre-exposed. We had a lot of assemblies to celebrate Indigenous peoples and actually some courses as well for Indigenous art and different
Okay.
things like that. So I really value that now. And looking back, I'm like, that was a great experience because I grew up already knowing a little bit. And I think that helps too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it kind of helps bring like the validity of like the
Mm,
stories is already having kind of an idea of what it is and not a real idea, not like, oh, this is what I
yep.
saw in a movie.
Yes,
But
exactly.
yeah, yeah, that's a
But I
great
think for
point
me
about your.
too,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, so I was just gonna say, so I knew the positive side, but I didn't know all the darker history that people
Mhm.
had experienced. And I think that's really important for people to hear about and learn about, as you said, to then move forward.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess I want to make one more comment. While we're
Mm,
on this topic, is like
yeah.
it's really not difficult to learn about the topics either. Like for anyone that wants to get more educated, I when I first started learning, because I didn't know who to reach out to, the first thing I did was I went and bought books by Indigenous authors.
Mm,
One book that I always recommend is called I think it's 100 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act, by Bob Joseph, and he goes through what the Indian Act is and how it's a piece of legislation that still discriminates against Indigenous people today. There's a lot of non-fiction Indigenous experiences, and then there's also like some of the fictional stories by Indigenous authors also weave in our different elements of our history and teachings and culture, which I've found really cool and really nice to read. But yeah, in saying that, make sure if you're grabbing a book, make sure it's by an Indigenous author. Because then you don't have to worry about if there's a bias there or not.
that's a really good suggestion.
Yeah.
Um, it, that kind of I want to kind of bring point to so you actually had an article published earlier this year in Organic Chemistry
Yeah.
titled An Indigenous Journey to Belonging. So maybe this is a good point to kind of bring this up now. And can you tell us a little bit about your article and how you found this opportunity?
Yeah. So the I think it was the American Chemical Society was doing a diversity and inclusion cover art series where they want to highlight minority groups that are in chemistry. And if you were an artist, you could make cover art that would go on a journal. So I actually didn't know about it, but my professor heard about it and was like, "Jen, you should do this. Like you do art, like you're an artist and you're a minority group and you're a chemistry person. Like you're a chemist." And it was funny because I was just like, "Yeah, whatever." Like, but then she kept bothering me. She's like, "Do this," and I was like, "Okay, fine." So I submitted my application. Because I don't really do cover art, I just submitted a photo, and this is actually included in the editorial. I included a photo of a drum that I've made, a dream catcher, and a pair of earrings that I've made. And they got back to me and they said, like, "We'd love to feature you. We'd love to hear your story. Um, we just your artwork as is doesn't really fit what we're looking for. So what if we set you up with a graphic designer who's already done a few journal covers for us and you guys can create something together and then we'll feature that." So I got to meet up with his name's Jeffrey Tao. He's done some covers for analytical chemistry.
Mm,
And I explained my story to him and I explained what I wanted to, I guess, convey, and also that I wanted the pieces of my art to be exhibited in this journal cover.
yeah.
So the idea was it was really awesome how like I didn't really have an idea in my head at the time. I kind of just told him about myself and my story, and he somehow like turned this into a picture. And then we worked together on how to like edit it to something I liked a bit better. And yeah, so the cover art, okay, I guess in this opportunity, like once I actually got it, I was like, I saw it as like it's an international platform to educate not just readers, but in particular chemists,
Mm,
about one, Indigenous issues, two, what like being an Indigenous chemist looks like, and three, that Indigenous people still exist.
yeah,
Um, globally, Canada, and I know this because I have lived abroad, globally, Canada is known as this really wonderful country, but in other places around the world, there are people that don't think we exist anymore. There are people that don't know anything about the history between Canada and Indigenous people, or they know about the policies we have now, but not the reason why those policies exist. And also the fact that many of these policies are still failing Indigenous communities today. Um, so I kind of wanted to encapsulate all of that. The other thing I really wanted to show was that just increased visibility throughout the entirety of my academic journey. I've felt alone. And one thing, once I really started understanding my heritage, was I realized that it's tricky because I can talk to people of non-Indigenous descent that I look up to about my experiences, but sometimes it's like we're both speaking English, but we're not speaking the same language. And
great.
that's been frustrating because it's one of those things where cool, I got to figure this out myself, I guess. And I wanted to for any other Indigenous students out there that are feeling the way I feel or in the future, I want them to see there is another person going through the same things. Because I think that's something that's really important. But yeah, going into the cover art, I guess, to explain it. So I'm pictured in front of a illustration of a dream catcher that I've made. Um, in my culture, the dream catcher is a item in which you place it above your bed when you sleep, and the dream catcher web captures everything good and bad. So spirits, energies, feelings, thoughts, um, everything. The good is passed down to the sleeper through the feathers, while the bad is captured within the web and then is released into the morning sunlight. So I thought this is actually a really cool way to illustrate what I am experiencing. Especially because I guess the only piece of my culture I ever really had was I've had a dream catcher since I was a baby. So it's really cool that that ended up being the way of telling the story, I suppose. So yeah, I'm pictured in front with the good things that I've worked for and that have come my way. So I'm wearing a graduation cap, so that is signifies my undergrad degree in chemistry and one day my PhD degree. And then I'm also featured wearing the first pair of earrings that I've ever made. So that's representative of me reconnecting with my culture. And then I'm also wearing a lab coat. So that's my journey as a chemist and my accomplishments here. And then within the web are the things I'm still reconciling with. So there's an image of the unmarked graves at residential schools. So that's just kind of reconciling with and still dealing with the feelings of how that has affected my family as a first generation survivor. In addition, the Canadian flag's in there because I have a really weird perspective in that on one hand, I was really, really lucky to have been born not only in the first part of the world, but the first part of Canada, and to get educated in that system. Because that has set me up for success in some ways. But at the same time, so it's recognizing that privilege, but at the same time, reconciling with all of the trauma and pain that this country has inflicted on my family, my people, and even myself. And then the last piece is just there's a little image of a person around a crowd of people, and it's kind of that feeling like I don't belong and trying to reconcile with that. So the idea there is those are trapped in within the web because I'm still dealing with them, but hopefully one day they'll be released into the sunlight.
It's a really great article, and I love the cover art, and
Thank
I
you.
love it even more hearing your story behind all the elements. It really brings it to life. So for everyone listening today, I did link the article for you guys in the chat, but if anyone wants to look it up after, you can just Google Jen's name in inorganic chemistry journal, and you should be able to find it pretty
Yeah.
easily. So it looks like I think we're getting close to our end of our time here. So maybe I'll end with one more question. I think you kind of already talked about this too, but what advice would you give to any Indigenous students who are interested in STEM, and maybe a final comment on us as researchers? What's one main takeaway you would like us to have for today?
Okay. I guess advice for future Indigenous youth is to it's to be honest, it's going to be really hard. But my advice is like, don't give up, and to believe in yourself when no one else will. Because that is something that I guess is important for life, not just STEM. But yeah, and if you're in university or in college and there is a resource center for Indigenous students, go there and access the resources. Even if you feel like you're not Indigenous enough, I will tell you that you are. You will find not just a community there, but access to so many resources. And if you feel like you don't know enough about your culture, you will likely learn about, not if not your culture, another culture that's like around in your area, that might help you feel more connected to your heritage, your culture, and your spirit. um in terms of like a takeaway for listeners, yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is just to listen to Indigenous stories and to don't make assumptions based on what you've heard in like in passing or in the news. Actually speak with an Indigenous person and learn about our experiences so you can understand to how to effectively be a good ally.
That's great. That's wonderful,
Thanks.
Jen. So I think we do have time if we have one question from any of our um, live audience here today. You can raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Anybody, anybody? Well, I don't see an, oh, yep, there's a question, Yasmin.
Sorry, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that Jen was my TA in third year at Guelph, and I'm so incredibly thankful to have had her as my TA because she showed the utmost understanding and kindness to all of her students. So thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, I think that just about wraps up our time for today. So I'll end with one final question, and it's a non-personal, well, kind of personal question, but what is your favorite chemistry element
um oh,
and
that's
why?
tricky. um I want to say probably gadolinium, solely
Ooh, interesting.
because that is one I've been working with a lot in terms of like making coordination complexes. And it does actually, okay, no, I changed my mind. It's dysprosium. I say this because dysprosium is known to like, the complexes with dysprosium are known to like make really good magnetic materials with very good magnetic properties. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
Nice.
Yes.
Awesome. That's so great. Well, thank you for your time and sharing with us today, Jen. We really appreciate it. And for all of our listeners, our next episode will be in November. So watch for the next advertisements for that. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.